shifted uneasily, awaiting the explosion. But Genghis Khan simply nodded and called for his generals. The winter of 1218 would see the birth of a new kind of warfare. "Every city will learn," he told his assembled commanders. His voice carried no anger, only certainty. "Those who submit live. Those who resist 3 days die. Those who harm my envoys." He paused, letting the words hang like smoke. "They become lessons." The policy emerged from cold calculation rather than rage. Previous campaigns had taught the Mongols that prolonged sieges drained resources and momentum. Cities might hold for weeks, even months, forcing the army to maintain supply lines across hostile territory. The 3-day rule solved this problem with mathematical elegance. Submit immediately and keep your lives, your property, your social structure. Resist 1 day and lose your leaders. Resist 2 days and lose your fighting men. Resist 3 days and lose everything. The gradient of consequences created its own terrible momentum. But the true genius lay in what happened after the 3 days expired. The systematic nature of the violence that followed served purposes beyond simple punishment. Each fallen city became a classroom, where young warriors learned the mechanics of occupation. First came the sorting. Mongol administrators had perfected a system as efficient as their arrow volleys. Men capable of bearing arms formed one group. Craftsmen, with valuable skills, another. Women divided by age, appearance, and social status. Children separated from mothers. The elderly assessed for knowledge or immediate disposal. The process unfolded with mechanical precision. No random violence, no uncontrolled looting. Every action served the dual purpose of eliminating threats and rewarding loyalty. A warrior who had shown exceptional courage might receive first choice of captives. Those who had wavered found themselves with scraps. Young Mongol soldiers watched and learned. They saw how systematic brutality broke spirits more effectively than random cruelty. They observed the careful balance between terror and incentive. Most importantly, they understood that conquered women represented more than simple plunder. The distribution of female captives followed strict hierarchies. Commanders claimed women of noble birth, adding them to personal retinues that might number in the dozens. These women often faced a strange twilight existence, neither wife nor slave, their status dependent entirely on their captors' whims. Some bore children who would ride with Mongol armies. Others vanished into the vast machinery of empire. Common soldiers received women based on merit and rank. A warrior who had taken 5 enemy heads might claim a merchant's daughter. One who had shown cowardice might receive only elderly servants. The system created competition, driving men to greater acts of valor and brutality. But special consideration awaited women who had actively resisted. The Mongol command structure had learned to identify these individuals through careful intelligence gathering. Which women had organized supplies for defenders? Who had tended the wounded? Who had stood on battlements, inspiring continued resistance? These women faced public humiliation, designed to break the spirit of future opponents. The specific methods varied, but the message remained constant. Resistance by anyone, regardless of gender, brought consequences that death might seem preferable to. The Mongols understood that female defiance particularly threatened their narrative of inevitable conquest. The psychological warfare extended beyond the immediate victims. Survivors were often released to spread their tales, becoming unwitting agents of Mongol propaganda. A traumatized refugee arriving at the next city carried more weight than 100 threats. Their hollow eyes and broken spirits spoke louder than any ultimatum. Within 3 years, the pattern had crystallized into doctrine. Mongol generals could predict with startling accuracy how long a city would resist based on its demographics, leadership, and defensive preparations. They adjusted their approaches accordingly, sometimes displaying lenience to encourage quick surrender, other times demonstrating extreme brutality to discourage regional resistance. The 3-day timer began the moment Mongol standards appeared on the horizon. City leaders faced an impossible calculation: surrender immediately and face humiliation but survival. Resist and hope for miracle reinforcements that never came. The pressure fractured alliances, turned counselors against each other, made every defensive decision a potential death sentence. Some cities tried negotiation, sending envoys to discuss terms. The Mongols had learned to use these diplomatic overtures to gather intelligence. How many defenders did the city have? What were their food supplies? Where did the walls show weakness? Every conversation became reconnaissance. The rules applied regardless of season or circumstance. Cities that fell during harvest season saw their crops seized to feed the Mongol war machine. Those taken in winter watched their fuel stores consumed while they froze. The systematic stripping of resources served both practical and psychological purposes. Religious sites received no special protection unless they surrendered instantly. Monks and priests who counseled resistance died alongside soldiers. Sacred texts burned with equal enthusiasm as accounting ledgers. The message was clear. No earthly or heavenly power could shield those who defied the Khan. The Mongol system had evolved to handle every contingency. Cities that surrendered after one day of resistance might keep their walls but lose their weapons. Those that lasted 2 days saw their fortifications demolished stone by stone. The 3-day threshold marked total erasure, not just of defenses but of civic identity. This methodical approach required extensive record-keeping. Mongol scribes, many of them captured Chinese administrators, maintained detailed logs of each conquest. Which cities had surrendered immediately? Which had resisted? What resources had been extracted? What percentage of the population had been eliminated or enslaved? The data served strategic purposes. Patterns emerged, showing which types of cities were most likely to resist. Wealthy trading centers often capitulated quickly to preserve their commercial networks. Fortress cities with strong military traditions held longer. Religious centers varied depending on their theology's stance on martyrdom. Young Mongol officers studied these records like sacred texts. They learned to read the signs of impending surrender. Gates left suspiciously open. Smoke signals between towers. The sudden silence of previously defiant defenders. Each tell saved time and resources. The 3-day rule also shaped Mongol logistics. Armies carried exactly enough supplies to maintain a brief siege. Anything longer required either foraging or supply lines, both vulnerable to counterattack. The policy forced defenders into rapid decisions, while keeping the Mongol force mobile and unpredictable. But human beings rarely follow predictable patterns. Some cities, driven by pride or desperation, chose annihilation over submission. Others surrendered immediately only to launch surprise attacks later. The Mongols adapted their responses to these variations, creating subcategories of punishment that maintained the system's terrible logic. The most feared response awaited cities that surrendered and then rebelled. These faced a savagery that exceeded even the 3-day punishment. Every inhabitant, regardless of age or gender, faced execution. The ruins were sown with salt or thoroughly destroyed to prevent resettlement. These ghost towns served as monuments to the price of betrayal. Word of such extremes spread through trade routes and refugee camps. Merchants debated whether to approach cities under Mongol threat. Farmers abandoned fields rather than risk being caught in a siege. The economic disruption preceded the armies by hundreds of miles. Inside Mongol camps, the 3-day rule created its own culture. Veterans shared stories of particularly stubborn cities, of clever tactics used to break resistance, of the moment when defiance finally crumbled. These tales served as both entertainment and education for younger warriors. The policy required absolute discipline from Mongol forces. Random violence before the 3-day deadline brought severe punishment. Commanders who allowed premature looting faced demotion or death. The system's effectiveness depended on its predictability. Enemies had to trust that surrender truly meant safety. This discipline extended to the treatment of captives. Women distributed according to rank could not be traded or abused beyond established parameters. Children marked for slavery had to be fed and maintained. Even in brutality, the Mongol system demanded order. But the human cost accumulated in ways the scribes couldn't quantify. Traumatized survivors carried psychological wounds that passed through generations. Children who had witnessed the systematic destruction of their families grew into adults shaped by unimaginable horror. The 3-day rule created ripples of suffering that would outlast the empire itself. Some Mongol generals began to question the long-term wisdom of such policies. Destroyed cities produced no taxes. Dead craftsmen created no goods. Women reduced to slavery bore children who might someday seek vengeance. But these voices remained minorities, drowned out by the immediate success of terror tactics. The three-day rule reached its most refined form just as Mongol forces turned toward the rich cities of Central Asia. Here, they would encounter populations with their own proud military traditions, their own histories of resistance. The collision would produce horrors that exceeded even Mongol expectations. In the war councils, discussion turned to Otrar. The city that had dared to execute Mongol envoys required special attention. The three-day rule would apply, but what happened after would demonstrate new depths of calculated cruelty. Genghis Khan himself would oversee this campaign. Otrar will beg for the three-day rule, one general predicted. Others nodded agreement. They had all seen what happened when the Khan took personal interest in a city's destruction. The normal parameters of conquest expanded into something darker. Preparations began immediately. Siege engineers calculated the exact force needed to breach Otrar's walls. Intelligence gatherers identified key figures in the city's defense. Most ominously, specialists in psychological warfare developed specific plans for the city's leadership. The campaign would require 5 tumens, 50,000 warriors. This represented a massive commitment of resources for a single city. But Otrar had transgressed beyond mere resistance. They had violated diplomatic immunity, challenged the very foundation of Mongol authority. As winter deepened, the greatest military machine of its era began to move. The three-day rule had evolved from a simple battlefield expedient into a cornerstone of empire. Cities from China to Persia had learned its terrible mathematics. But some lessons require repeated teaching. The women of conquered cities had become pawns in this vast game of domination and submission, their fates intertwined with military policy in ways that would echo through centuries. The systematic approach to sexual violence as a tool of warfare had reached new levels of organization under Mongol rule. In the grand strategy of conquest, individual suffering became statistical data. How many women distributed per 1,000 warriors? What percentage should be reserved for commanders? How many released to spread tales of horror? The calculations proceeded with the same cold logic used for arrow supplies and horse remounts. But numbers could not capture the moment when a mother was separated from her children, when a young woman realized her fate, when entire female populations faced the mechanical sorting that followed conquest. These human moments of terror and despair fueled the engine of Mongol expansion as surely as grass fed their horses. The three-day rule had become more than military policy. It represented a worldview that divided humanity into conquerors and conquered, with different rules applying to each. Within this system, women who dared to resist faced consequences, designed to echo through history. As the Mongol forces assembled for the march on Otrar, veterans shared knowing looks. They had seen the pattern too many times. First would come the ultimatum, then the brief, doomed resistance, then the systematic unraveling of an entire civilization. The three-day clock would tick with mechanical inevitability. But Otrar would prove different. The city's defenders, led by an unlikely commander, would stretch Mongol patience to its breaking point. The resulting fury would demonstrate why some historians mark this campaign as the moment when calculated brutality transformed into something approaching madness. The genetic evidence would shock historians centuries later. The great Khatun's voice carried across the windswept plateau. 10,000 Mongol warriors knelt as she pronounced judgment on a soldier who had violated her daughter. The man's head rolled into the dust before her words finished echoing. No one moved. No one breathed. The law was absolute within the empire's borders. 500 miles south, different sounds filled the air. A young woman's pleas cut short by a warrior's fist. The systematic sorting of human beings in a conquered square. The crack of whips driving captive columns toward an uncertain fate. The same warriors who would face death for touching a Mongol woman now claimed their prizes from the fallen city. Genghis Khan had built this contradiction into the very foundation of his empire. His own mother, Hoelun, had been kidnapped and forced into marriage. His wife Bertha had suffered months of captivity, returning pregnant with another man's child. These personal wounds shaped laws that would govern millions, but the protection extended only to those deemed worthy of it. The Yasa, the great law code, spoke with crystalline clarity. Any Mongol who raped a woman of the tribes faced immediate execution, no trial, no appeal. The sentence carried out by the victim's male relatives, or, lacking those, by appointed executioners. The same code that mandated death for theft of a horse or urinating into water also drew an absolute line around Mongol women's bodies. Within the jurs of the homeland, women exercised power unimaginable in settled kingdoms. They managed vast herds while men campaigned. They negotiated trade agreements that moved silk and silver across continents. They advised on matters of war and peace. Their counsel weighted equally with any generals. The great Khatun Turagain would one day rule the entire empire as regent, commanding the loyalty of the same warriors who showed no mercy to enemy women. The youngest Mongol girls learned to ride and shoot alongside their brothers. They participated in the great hunts, driving game into killing grounds with the same coordination used in battle. Marriage came through negotiation and bride prices, not capture. A Mongol woman could divorce an unsatisfactory husband, keeping her dowry and children. She could own property, lead military units, serve as judge in legal matters. This freedom created fierce loyalty among Mongol women toward their empire. They understood viscerally what separation from its protection meant. When Mongol princesses married foreign princes as part of diplomatic arrangements, they traveled with guards who would kill any man who mistreated them. The message resonated clear as struck bronze. Mongol women belonged to a different category of humanity. The border between protected and prey ran sharp as any blade. A woman born to Mongol parents enjoyed safeguards that extended unto death. A woman born outside the tribes existed in a legal void, her status determined entirely by conquest and capture. The distinction had nothing to do with virtue, beauty, or behavior. Only birth and submission mattered. Young Mongol warriors learned this compartmentalization through careful conditioning. The same boy who would face execution for insulting his sister learned to see enemy women as legitimate plunder. Training exercises reinforced the division. Protect the women of the tribe with your life. Take the women of enemies as your right. No contradiction existed in the Mongol mind because these were entirely separate categories. The system created unexpected dynamics in conquered territories. Local women sometimes attempted to claim Mongol protection through marriage or concubinage. A fortunate few succeeded, their children raised as full members of the tribe, but most found themselves trapped in a twilight existence, no longer members of their birth community, but never truly Mongol. Children born from these unions occupied complex positions. Sons might join Mongol military units if their fathers acknowledged them. Daughters might marry Mongol warriors, gaining protection their mothers never enjoyed. But the stigma of mixed birth followed them, creating hierarchies within hierarchies. Pure Mongol blood meant pure Mongol protection. Everything else existed on a spectrum of vulnerability. The empire's expansion created vast networks of women living under different legal realities. In the homeland, Mongol women bought and sold goods, argued legal cases, rode to war when necessary. In conquered territories, local women navigated survival in a system that classified them as property. Between these extremes, countless gradations existed. Some conquered women gained favor through exceptional beauty or skills. A talented weaver might find herself protected as a valuable craftsperson. A woman versed in medicine could earn respect and relative safety. But these exceptions proved the rule. Without Mongol blood or formal submission, protection remained conditional and revocable. The Mongol legal system attempted to codify these distinctions with typical precision. Different punishments applied for crimes against Mongol women versus conquered women. Killing a Mongol woman brought death by torture. Killing a slave woman meant paying compensation to her owner. The human being herself had no legal standing, only her value to a Mongol master. This legal framework created perverse incentives. Mongol warriors had every reason to keep captured women alive and relatively healthy. Dead slaves produced no children or labor. But beyond basic survival, no protections existed. The law concerned itself with property rights, not human dignity. Within Mongol camps, the treatment of captured women followed established protocols. New captives underwent immediate evaluation. Age, appearance, skills, and health determined initial distribution. Beautiful women went to commanders. Strong women became laborers. Older women might serve as camp followers or face immediate execution if deemed useless. The process mirrored the efficiency used in military operations. No random violence that might damage valuable property. No killing that would waste potential resources. Every action calculated to extract maximum value from conquered populations. Women represented reproducible wealth, future warriors, future slaves, future bargaining chips. Some historians would later argue this system showed Mongol pragmatism rather than cruelty. Dead enemies produced nothing, enslaved enemies enriched the empire. But such cold analysis ignored the human cost of reducing half of conquered populations to breeding stock and forced labor. The efficiency made the horror systematic rather than random. Mongol women themselves participated in this system, often as active agents. The wives of commanders selected servants from among captives. They organized the labor of enslaved women, directed their work, punished infractions. The protected became protectors of hierarchy, understanding that their own status depended on maintaining clear distinctions. Records from Chinese sources describe Mongol princesses traveling with retinues of hundreds of captured women. These servants existed in careful gradations: personal attendants, craftswomen, common laborers. The princess's power over them was absolute, but so was her responsibility to maintain them. Starving one's slaves showed poor management, not mercy. The complexity deepened in settled territories under long-term Mongol rule. Over time, accommodation replaced acute violence. Local women who had survived the conquest learned to navigate the new reality. Some found protectors among Mongol administrators. Others disappeared into the anonymous machinery of empire. The sharp trauma of conquest dulled into chronic oppression. But military campaigns continued to produce fresh supplies of captive women. Each victory renewed the cycle. AI, sort, distribute, integrate into existing hierarchies. Veterans taught newcomers the rules: survive by being useful, attract protection through beauty or skills, bear children who might elevate your status, accept that resistance meant death or worse. The Mongol expansion created the largest contiguous empire in human history. Within its borders, protected women exercised freedoms remarkable for the 13th century. Outside its protection, conquered women faced systematic exploitation on an unprecedented scale. The same legal code that executed men for harming Mongol women regulated the rape of conquered women like the distribution of horses. Genghis Khan's personal history shaped these contradictions. His mother's kidnapping and forced remarriage taught him that women without protection became prey. His wife's captivity reinforced the lesson. But rather than developing universal principles of protection, he created a system that extended safety only to those within his expanding circle of power. The psychological impact rippled through generations. Mongol women raised their daughters to understand their privileged position. Conquered women taught survival strategies to their children. Mixed heritage children navigated between worlds, never fully belonging to either. The empire created complex genealogies of trauma and protection. Modern genetic studies would later reveal the stunning scope of this systematic violence. Across Asia, millions carry genetic markers tracing to a handful of Mongol men. The numbers tell a story written in DNA, tCNA, conquest followed by systematic rape on a scale that permanently altered the genetic landscape of entire continents. Behind each marker lies a woman whose choice was survival or death. But the empire's dual nature created spaces for unexpected agency. Some Mongol women used their protected status to shelter conquered women. Others facilitated trade networks that allowed subjugated populations economic opportunities. The rigid system contained enough flexibility for individual kindness, though never enough to challenge its fundamental brutality. Foreign observers struggle to understand these contradictions. Byzantine ambassadors reported shock at seeing Mongol women leading military units, while conquered women were sold in markets. Islamic chroniclers noted the irony of Mongol laws protecting women's property rights while treating conquered women as property. Chinese historians recorded the confusion of their own women. Should they hope for Mongol husbands who might protect them, or fear Mongol conquest that would strip all protections. The 3-day rule intersected with these gender dynamics in particularly cruel ways. Cities that surrendered immediately might keep their social structures intact, including traditional protections for women. Those that resisted faced the systematic destruction of all such safeguards. The timer counted down not just to general massacre but to the specific obliteration of whatever dignity and safety women had known. Mongol commanders understood this psychological weapon. Negotiations often included detailed descriptions of what would happen to the city's women after 3 days. The threats were not idle. Veterans could recite exact protocols, how women would be sorted, distributed, used. The clinical precision of planned atrocity often broke resistance more effectively than catapults. Some cities attempted to negotiate separate protections for their women. The Mongols occasionally agreed, but only for immediate surrender. Even then, the definition of protection remained fluid. Safety from death did not mean safety from enslavement. Promises to spare women's lives said nothing about what those lives would entail. The siege of Urgench demonstrated these dynamics with particular clarity. As the 3-day deadline approached, city leaders offered to surrender all wealth if their women could remain free. The Mongol commander's response was simple. Women were wealth. The offer made no sense. How could one separate plunder from plunder? When cities did resist past 3 days, the consequences for women followed predictable patterns. First came the sorting in the public square, then distribution according to rank and merit. But special attention focused on women who had actively supported resistance. These faced public humiliation, designed to demonstrate the price of defiance. The records speak in euphemisms, but survivors' accounts preserved by Persian historians reveal the systematic nature of sexual violence. Women who had tended wounded defenders, who had carried water to the walls, who had shouted encouragement during battle. 1-5. All identified and punished according to their level of participation. The message broadcast clear. Gender provided no shield against the consequences of resistance. Within the Mongol worldview, this made perfect sense. An enemy was an enemy, regardless of sex. Women who acted against Mongol interests placed themselves in the same category as male warriors. They had chosen to leave the protected sphere of submission and enter the dangerous realm of defiance. The punishment fit the crime, as Mongol law defined such things. But these laws had one devastating exception. In cities marked for special punishment, even immediate surrender might not guarantee protection. The ordinary rules of conquest could be suspended when Genghis Khan declared total war. In these cases, the 3-day rule became meaningless. Time would not save anyone. The Mongol legal code drew a line sharp as any sword blade. On one side stood the protected women of the tribes, shielded by laws that mandated death for any violation. On the other sprawled the vast populations of conquered territories, where different rules applied. The same warrior who would die for touching a Mongol woman without permission could claim conquered women as casual plunder. This duality emerged from calculated policy rather than oversight. Genghis Khan had witnessed his mother's kidnapping, his wife's captivity. These personal wounds shaped laws that would govern millions. But the protection extended only to those deemed worthy of it. Everyone else existed in a carefully structured system of vulnerability. The distinction created its own brutal mathematics. A woman born to Mongol parents enjoyed safeguards that followed her from the steppes to the borders of settled kingdoms. A woman born outside the tribes faced a legal void where her status depended entirely on conquest and capture. Birth determined everything. Virtue, beauty, intelligence meant nothing without the accident of Mongol blood. Young warriors learned this separation through years of conditioning. The same boys who faced execution for insulting their sisters trained to see enemy women as legitimate rewards. No contradiction troubled their minds because these represented entirely different categories of being. The lessons came wrapped in tradition, in stories of conquest, in the careful passing of who deserved protection and who existed beyond its reach. The empire's expansion magnified these contradictions across continents. In the Mongol heartland, women bought and sold goods, argued legal cases, advised on military strategy. Their daughters learned to ride and shoot, to manage vast herds, to exercise power that would shame the cloistered queens of Europe. The great Khatuns commanded armies, negotiated treaties, ruled as regents over the largest land empire ever assembled. Their word could execute generals or elevate slaves, but travel south across the conquest line and the picture transformed. Here, women sorted like grain in public squares, mothers separated from children according to age and usefulness. Young women distributed among warriors based on beauty and the fighter's merit in battle. The elderly assessed for skills or marked for disposal. The same administrative efficiency that moved armies across impossible distances now processed human beings with mechanical precision. The Yasa codified these distinctions with typical Mongol clarity. Kill a Mongol woman and face death by torture. Kill a slave woman and pay compensation to her owner. Rape within the tribes brought immediate execution. Rape of conquered women followed established protocols of distribution and reward. The legal framework concerned itself with property rights, not human dignity. A destroyed wagon required more compensation than a dead captive. Within Mongol camps, the treatment of captured women followed strict hierarchies. Commanders claimed those of noble birth or exceptional beauty. Common soldiers received distributions based on rank and battlefield performance. A warrior who had shown cowardice might receive only elderly servants. One who had taken 5 enemy heads could claim a merchant's daughter. The system created competition, driving men to greater acts of valor, measured in both enemy deaths and living prizes. Some women found unexpected spaces within this brutal structure. A talented weaver might earn protection through her craft. A woman versed in medicine could gain respect and relative safety. Beauty coupled with intelligence occasionally elevated a concubine to influence. But these exceptions proved the rule. Without Mongol blood or formal submission, protection remained conditional, revocable, subject to the whims of masters. The children born from these unions occupied complex positions. Sons might eventually join Mongol military units if their fathers acknowledged them. Daughters could marry Mongol warriors, gaining protection their mothers never enjoyed. But the stigma of mixed birth created hierarchies within hierarchies. Pure Mongol blood meant pure Mongol protection. Everything else existed on a spectrum of vulnerability that shifted with political winds. The psychological impact rippled through generations. Mongol women raised daughters to understand their privileged position, to guard it fiercely. Conquered women taught survival strategies to their children, lessons written in whispers and careful silences. Mixed heritage children navigated between worlds, never fully belonging to either, their status dependent on their usefulness to the empire. Foreign observers struggled to comprehend these contradictions. Byzantine ambassadors reported shock at seeing Mongol women leading military units while conquered women were sold in the same camps. Islamic chroniclers noted the bitter irony of Mongol laws protecting women's property rights while treating conquered women as property. Chinese historians recorded the confusion of their own populations. Should women hope for Mongol husbands who might offer protection, or fear conquest that would strip away all traditional safeguards? The 3-day rule intersected with gender dynamics in particularly calculated ways. Cities that surrendered immediately might keep their social structures intact, preserving traditional protections for women. Those that resisted faced systematic destruction of all such safeguards. The timer counted down not just to general massacre, but to the specific obliteration of female dignity and autonomy. Mongol commanders wielded this knowledge as a weapon. Negotiations often included detailed descriptions of what would happen to the city's women after 3 days. They could recite exact protocols with the same precision used for battle formations. How women would be sorted in the public square, the criteria for distribution, the special attention reserved for those who had actively supported resistance. The clinical precision of planned atrocity often broke defenses more effectively than siege engines. Some cities attempted desperate negotiations, offering all wealth if their women could remain free. Mongol responses revealed the fundamental worldview. Women were wealth. The offer made no sense. How could one separate plunder from plunder? The conceptual gap proved unbridgeable. One side saw human beings, the other saw resources to be harvested. When cities did resist past the 3-day deadline, consequences for women followed predictable patterns. First came the sorting in conquered squares, efficiency refined through countless repetitions. Age, appearance, perceived usefulness determined immediate fate, then distribution according to the elaborate hierarchies of merit and rank, but special attention focused on women who had actively supported resistance. The records speak in euphemisms that barely mask the horror. Women who had tended wounded defenders, who had carried water to the battlements, who had shouted encouragement during assaults, all identified through intelligence gathered during siege, all punished according to their level of participation. The message broadcast across conquered territories could not have been clearer. Gender provided no shield against the consequences of defiance. Within the Mongol framework, this made perfect sense. An enemy was an enemy regardless of sex. Women who acted against Mongol interests placed themselves in the same category as male warriors. They had chosen to leave the theoretical protection of submission. The punishment fit the crime as Mongol law defined such things. That the punishment often exceeded death in its cruelty served to discourage future female resistance. But exceptions existed even within this brutal system. Sometimes a conquered woman caught the eye of a powerful Mongol, not just for beauty, but for intelligence, spirit, or useful skills. These women might find themselves elevated from slave to concubine to wife. Their children might claim Mongol heritage. A few even gained enough influence to protect other conquered women, creating small islands of mercy within the vast machinery of oppression. The genetic evidence would later stun historians. Across Asia, millions carry markers tracing to a handful of Mongol men. The numbers tell their own story of conquest, followed by systematic rape on a scale that permanently altered the genetic landscape of continents. Behind each marker lies a woman whose choice was survival or death. Behind each survivor lies a story of accommodation to power that held life and death in its casual hands. But the empire's dual nature created unexpected opportunities. Some Mongol women used their protected status to shelter conquered women, though always within limits. Trade networks run by Mongol princesses might employ conquered women in positions of relative safety. Individual kindness existed, but never enough to challenge the system's fundamental structure. Mercy remained personal. Brutality stayed institutional. The siege of Urgench demonstrated these dynamics with particular clarity. As the 3-day deadline approached, city elders made increasingly desperate offers. All gold, all goods, everything except their women. The Mongol commander's response was recorded by a Persian chronicler who survived by switching sides. The general laughed and asked how they proposed to separate types of wealth. Did they also wish to keep their horses, their silk, their silver? Women were simply another category of movable goods. When Urgench finally fell after months of resistance, the sorting took 3 days. The Mongols had perfected their system through repetition. Women lined up by age groups, the young and beautiful to one side, those of middle years assessed for skills, the elderly evaluated for immediate usefulness, children separated by sex and age. The process unfolded with the same mechanical precision used to process captured livestock. Special units had developed to handle this human inventory. Mongol women often supervised, understanding the hierarchies involved. A general's wife might select personal servants. Lower-ranking women chose from what remained. The conquered selecting other conquered, power flowing downward in carefully controlled streams, everyone understanding their place in the vast machine of empire. The impact on conquered societies proved devastating beyond the immediate violence. Traditional protections for women, developed over centuries, shattered in days. Social structures that had provided security collapsed. Religious authorities that might have offered sanctuary found themselves powerless or dead. The systematic nature of the conquest left no institution standing that might shield women from their new reality. In some regions, the complete breakdown of traditional authority created strange new dynamics. Women who had been rigidly controlled by their own societies found themselves in a paradoxical position. Mongol law cared nothing for their previous restrictions. A Muslim woman who survived conquest might find herself with more freedom of movement than before, though that freedom came at the price of all protection. Some adapted to become traders, healers, even administrators within the new order. But most faced a grinding reality of servitude and sexual exploitation. The lucky ones found protectors among their conquerors. The unlucky disappeared into the anonymous machinery of empire, their names forgotten, their stories preserved only in the genetic traces they left behind. Between these extremes, millions navigated daily survival in a system that classified them as somewhere between human and livestock. The Mongol expansion created the largest contiguous empire in human history. Within its borders, Mongol women exercised freedoms remarkable for any century. Outside its protection, conquered women faced systematic exploitation on an unprecedented scale. The same legal code that executed men for harming Mongol women regulated the distribution of conquered women with the precision of a merchant's ledger. The 3-day rule added temporal pressure to these dynamics. As deadlines approached, city leaders faced impossible choices: surrender immediately and watch their women enslaved but alive, resist and see them face horrors that made slavery seem merciful. The timer created its own momentum, fracturing resistance as defenders calculated whether 3 days of freedom justified an eternity of consequences. Some cities tried creative interpretations. They would surrender the walls but not the citadel. They would open gates but claim their women had already fled. The Mongols had seen every variation. Partial surrender meant partial mercy, with women paying the price for their men's hesitation. The only safety lay in complete, immediate capitulation. Everything else invited gradations of horror. The psychological warfare extended to the siege itself. Mongol commanders ensured that city defenders could hear the screams from previously conquered populations. Women's voices carried across the walls, wordless testimony to the fate awaiting resistance. Sometimes the Mongols would parade captured women from neighboring cities, allowing defenders to see the future they were choosing with each hour of defiance. Inside besieged cities, these pressures created their own tragedies. Some women begged their men to surrender, others chose death over capture, throwing themselves from walls or taking poison. Families fractured as survival instincts battled cultural honor. The 3-day rule achieved its purpose by creating unbearable tensions within defended populations. When resistance did continue past the deadline, the aftermath followed scripts written in previous conquests. But each city added its own variations to the horror. Local dynamics, personal vendettas, the specific composition of the conquering force all influenced how the systematic violence unfolded. The only constant was that women who had actively resisted faced special attention. The Mongol system had evolved to identify these women with frightening efficiency. Intelligence networks, often staffed by previous conquered populations, gathered names and descriptions. Which women had organized supplies? Who had rallied defenders? Who possessed medical knowledge used to treat wounded soldiers? The information gathering proceeded alongside military operations, creating lists for post-conquest action. This targeting served multiple purposes beyond simple punishment. It eliminated potential future resistance leaders. It demonstrated the futility of defiance regardless of gender. Most importantly, it created examples that would echo through surrounding territories. The story of what happened to resistant women often traveled faster than the Mongol armies themselves. The records preserved by Persian and Arab chroniclers speak to the systematic nature of these reprisals. Women identified as resistance supporters faced public humiliation, designed to break the spirit of future opponents. The specific methods varied, but the message remained constant. Choose submission or face consequences that death would seem preferable to. The Mongols understood that female defiance particularly threatened their narrative of inevitable conquest. Modern genetic studies reveal the stunning scope of what followed these conquests. The Y chromosome markers tell a mathematical story of violence. Millions across Asia carry the genetic signature of a small number of Mongol men. The numbers speak to systematic rape on a scale that permanently altered the human genome across continents. Each marker represents a woman who faced the choice between submission and death. But within this vast machinery of horror, individual stories of survival emerged. Some women found ways to protect themselves and others through intelligence, beauty, or useful skills. Others disappeared into the anonymous masses, their names forgotten, but their genetic legacy spreading through generations. A few even rose to positions of influence within the Mongol hierarchy, though always marked by their conquered origins. The duality of Mongol law created a schizophrenic reality across the empire. In one province, A Mongol woman might command thousands of troops, her word carrying the weight of life and death. In the next valley, conquered women sorted like cattle faced futures determined by the whims of their captors. The same legal code governed both realities without acknowledging any contradiction. This system would reach its most refined and terrible expression in the campaign against Otrar. The city that had dared to execute Mongol envoys required special attention. The 3-day rule would apply, but what came after would demonstrate new depths of calculated cruelty. Genghis Khan himself would oversee this campaign, bringing personal attention to the fate of those who had defied his authority. The preparations revealed the importance placed on this particular conquest. 50,000 warriors, siege engines capable of reducing walls to rubble, and most ominously, specialists in psychological warfare who understood how to break a population's spirit. The normal parameters of conquest would expand into something darker, something designed to echo through history as a warning. Intelligence gatherers had already begun their work, identifying key figures in Otrar's defense. Among the names that surfaced was an unexpected one: the governor's wife, a woman who had spent decades managing household accounts and arguing with carpet sellers. The same woman who would soon stand on battlements with a jeweled dagger, rallying defenders with words that would seal her fate. The Mongols had encountered female resistance before, but rarely from someone of such high social standing. The intelligence reports noted her transformation from merchant's daughter to military commander with the clinical interest of professionals studying a new phenomenon. How had a woman raised for marriage and motherhood become the spiritual heart of a doomed defense? The answer lay in the cascade of losses that preceded the siege. First her eldest son, cut down in a border skirmish. Then the middle boy, lost defending a supply caravan. Finally her husband, the governor, felled by an assassin's blade just days before the Mongol host arrived. With the city's leadership decimated and panic spreading through the streets, she had stepped into the void with a determination born of nothing left to lose. The Mongol commanders recognized the danger she represented. A woman leading resistance challenged their entire narrative of conquest. If merchants' wives could transform into military leaders, if mothers could rally defenders as effectively as any general, then the careful categories that structured Mongol society meant nothing. She had to be not just defeated but destroyed in a way that would discourage any woman from following her example. As the great host approached Otrar's walls, veterans shared knowing looks. They had seen this pattern before. The ultimatum would come. The city would resist. The 3 days would pass. Then would come the sorting, the distribution, the special attention for those who had defied the natural order. But Otrar would prove different in ways that would haunt even hardened warriors. In one trading city, a merchant's daughter would change everything. Dawn brought riders to Otrar's gates. Gulnar counted them from her bedroom window. 20 scouts testing the walls. She pulled her shawl tighter and descended to the courtyard where her youngest son prepared his horse. "Mother," Rashid's voice cracked. 17 years old and trying to sound like his dead brothers. "The council meets within the hour." She nodded and watched him ride toward the garrison. 3 sons she had raised, 2 already buried. The arithmetic of loss carved hollows in her chest. Her husband's blood still stained the council chamber floor where the assassin's blade had found him 5 nights ago. The great hall filled with arguing voices. Old men who had grown fat on trade routes now debated surrender terms. General Karim slammed his fist on the table. "The Khan demands blood for his envoys. Nothing we offer will satisfy him." Gulnar entered through the side door. Conversation stopped. A merchant's wife had no place in war councils. She had sold silk and supervised kitchen accounts. Her world consisted of ledgers and seasonal festivals. These men expected her to retreat into mourning. "My lords," her voice carried across the silence, "the Mongols will arrive within 3 days." Murmurs rippled through the assembled nobles. Uzbek the elder stood, his joints creaking like old leather. "Lady Gulnar, we grieve your loss. But military matters require." "Require what?" She stepped into the light from the high windows. "Experience my husband no longer provides? Wisdom from generals who have never faced the Khan's armies?" Young Captain Yusuf shifted uncomfortably. He had loved her middle son, had wept at his funeral. Now his hand moved to his sword hilt as voices rose in protest. The governor's widow speaks truth. Yusuf's words cut through the noise. We have 70,000 people within these walls, 5,000 trained soldiers. The Mongols bring 50,000 veterans. The mathematics silence them. Gulnar had spent her life calculating profit margins. She understood when numbers told stories of inevitable loss. But something harder than arithmetic moved in her chest now. Show me the defenses. The command emerged before she could stop it. If we must fall, let us make them pay for every street. General Karim's laugh held no humor. What does a silk merchant's daughter know of warfare? Nothing. Gulnar met his gaze. But I know my husband's notes. Every supply depot, every hidden grain store, every weakness in our walls he worried about during sleepless nights. She produced a leather portfolio from beneath her robes. Her husband's precise handwriting covered pages of defensive preparations, maps annotated with concerns, calculations of how long their food would last under siege. The work of a careful administrator who had feared this day would come. Silence stretched through the hall. These men had known her as a mother, a hostess, a manager of domestic affairs. The transformation unsettled them. Women did not speak in war councils. They certainly did not issue commands. The Khan offers terms to cities that submit immediately. Uzbek's voice wavered between hope and shame. Perhaps negotiation. Aye. He offers slavery. Gulnar's words cracked like a whip. Our women distributed among his warriors, our children raised to forget their names. Is that the legacy you choose? Captain Yusuf straightened. Other young officers exchanged glances. The older councillors shifted uneasily, caught between tradition and the absence of alternatives. I propose a vote. General Karim's tone suggested he already knew the outcome. Those who support negotiation. Wait. Gulnar raised her hand. Through the window, dust clouds marked the approaching scouts. Before you choose, hear what I offer. She moved to the great map painted on the wall. Her fingers traced streets she had walked for 30 years, markets where she had haggled over silk prices, squares where her sons had played as children. My husband spent 15 years fortifying Otrar. He knew every strength and every weakness. Her voice gained strength with each word. I sat through 1,000 dinner conversations about wall heights and arrow supplies. I memorized his fears because they kept him awake beside me. The portfolio opened to reveal detailed plans, guard rotations, water supplies, hidden passages for moving troops, the accumulated paranoia of a border city administrator. Give me tactical command. The words hung in the air like smoke. Let Karim lead the soldiers. Let Yusuf inspire the young men. But let me show you how a merchant's daughter defends her home. Laughter erupted from several quarters. General Karim's face darkened to purple. Traditional authority crumbled in the face of desperate circumstances, but not without resistance. This is madness. The general's voice shook. A woman cannot. Cannot what? Gulnar's interruption surprised even her. Cannot count our supplies? Cannot organize distributions? Cannot stand on walls and show others that courage has no gender? Captain Yusuf moved first. He crossed the hall and knelt before her. The gesture sent ripples through the room. Other young officers followed, then older men who had known her husband. Finally, even those who objected found themselves swept along by momentum. Only General Karim remained standing. His military pride warred with practical reality. The city needed unity. Division meant certain death. If we do this, his words came slowly, you follow my battle orders, no interference with troop movements. Agreed. Gulnar helped Yusuf to his feet. But I control supplies, civilian organization, and... She paused, gathering courage for the final demand. I speak for Otrar in any negotiations. The vote proceeded with mechanical efficiency. Fear overcame tradition. Desperation bred innovation. When the counting finished, Gulnar found herself the de facto leader of a doomed city. Word spread through the streets like wildfire. The governor's widow had taken command. Reactions ranged from scandal to desperate hope. In the women's quarters, something else stirred. If she could stand before the council, perhaps they too could do more than wait for conquest. The first volunteers arrived before sunset. Wives of dead soldiers, daughters of merchants, sisters who had lost brothers. They came carrying water jugs and bandage rolls, but their eyes held harder intentions. "We can tend the wounded." A baker's widow spoke for the group. "Free men for fighting." Gulnar studied their faces. She saw her own loss reflected, multiplied. These women understood the mathematics of defeat. They chose defiance anyway. More than that, her decision crystallized. "You'll help me organize something the Mongols won't expect." Night fell as she explained her intentions. Traditional warfare assumed women would cower and wait. The Mongols counted on it. Their 3-day rule depended on defenders eventually breaking when they contemplated their families' fates. "We'll turn their weapon against them." Gulnar's voice carried new authority. "When they expect us to beg for mercy, we'll show them that Otra's women choose death over dishonor." The transformation had begun. By morning it would accelerate. Within days, the silk merchant's daughter would stand on battlements with a jeweled dagger, speaking words that would echo through history. But first came the work of preparation. Supply lists needed updating. Water reserves required protection. The hidden grain stores her husband had worried about demanded inspection. 1,000 details that meant the difference between 3 days of resistance and something longer. Something that might cost the Mongols dearly enough to remember. Gulnar worked through the night, surrounded by ledgers and maps. The same skills that had made her successful in trade now turned toward a darker purpose. Calculate, organize, distribute. The mathematics of siege warfare proved remarkably similar to managing caravan supplies. Captain Yusuf brought reports hourly. The Mongol scouts had withdrawn but would return with the main force. 3 days at most, possibly 2. Time compressed into desperate preparation. "My lady," Yusuf hesitated at the door. "General Karim wishes to review the defensive positions at dawn. Tell him I'll be there." She didn't look up from her calculations. With 50 women trained in basic medical care. His footsteps faded. Gulnar allowed herself one moment of pure terror. Her husband lay dead. Her sons fed carrion birds. Now she prepared to lead 30,000 civilians in hopeless resistance against history's most efficient killers. The merchant's daughter, who had once argued over carpet prices, would soon face Mongol generals across negotiation tables. If negotiations even occurred. The Khan's rage over his murdered envoys might exclude any discussion beyond immediate surrender or total annihilation. She returned to her lists. Each entry represented lives that would depend on her decisions. Each calculation carried the weight of families who trusted her unprecedented leadership. The transformation from merchant's wife to military commander accelerated with each passing hour. By dawn, Otra would be as ready as 3 decades of her husband's paranoia could make it. The rest would depend on courage, desperation, and whether a silk merchant's daughter could convince hardened warriors that resistance meant more than survival. The Mongol response would become legendary in its cruelty. The war drums echoed across the plain like thunder rolling through mountain passes. 50,000 Mongol warriors spread across the horizon, their approach marked by dust clouds that turned the morning sun blood red. From Otra's highest tower, Gulnar watched the mechanical precision of their deployment. Each unit moved with practiced efficiency, surrounding the city like water filling a bowl. The drums beat a specific rhythm, 3 strikes followed by silence, the universal Mongol demand for submission. General Karim stood beside her, his knuckles white against the stone parapet. 20 years of military service had not prepared him for this sight. The Mongol force moved as a single organism, each component perfectly synchronized. Their siege engines rolled forward on massive wheels, pulled by teams of oxen taken from conquered territories. Behind them, the support units established camps with speed that defied belief. "They give us 3 days." Karim's voice cracked on the final word. After that, Gulnar nodded, her eyes fixed on the center of the Mongol line where a white yurt rose like a snow-capped peak, the Khan's mobile palace from which death sentences would flow. She had spent the night studying her husband's notes on Mongol tactics, learning their patterns of conquest. Cities that resisted past the 3rd sunset faced systematic annihilation designed to serve as examples. Captain Yusuf arrived breathless from the eastern wall. His report came in short bursts between gasps for air. "They've blocked every road. No messengers can escape. We're sealed inside. The isolation was intentional, Gulnar understood. No word of Otra's fate would spread until the Mongols chose to release it. Whatever happened here would become a story told on their terms, shaped to inspire maximum terror in future targets. She turned to address the assembled commanders, men who had grudgingly accepted her leadership when no alternatives existed. Station the volunteers at medical posts throughout the city. Her voice carried new authority born from necessity. When the bombardment begins, a horn blast cut through her words. From the Mongol lines, a small party rode forward under diplomatic banners. 3 interpreters, 2 scribes, and a general whose scarred face spoke of countless battles. They stopped just beyond arrow range, their intentions clear. The final opportunity for negotiation had arrived. Gulnar descended the tower stairs, her mind racing through possibilities. The women who had volunteered to assist waited in the courtyard below, their faces mixing determination with barely controlled fear. These weren't warriors. They were bakers' wives, merchants' daughters, women who had never held weapons larger than kitchen knives. Yet they stood ready to tend wounded under fire, to carry water to defenders, to face whatever came. My lady, the baker's widow, who had first volunteered, stepped forward. The medical supplies are distributed as you ordered, but we need to know when they breach the walls. We hold as long as possible. Gulnar's answer came without hesitation. Every hour we resist costs them resources. Every day we stand makes the next city's choice easier. The truth hung unspoken between them. They all understood the mathematics. 50,000 against 5,000. The outcome was predetermined. Only the cost remained negotiable. How many Mongol lives could they claim? How long could they make the conquerors remember Otra? General Karim intercepted her at the main gate. His opposition to her leadership had softened into grudging respect over the past 2 days. The silk merchant's daughter had proven surprisingly competent at organizing civilian resistance. Still, tradition died hard. Let me conduct the negotiation. His offer came wrapped in paternalistic concern. They expect to speak with military men. They expect submission. Gulnar adjusted the ceremonial robe she had inherited from her husband's wardrobe. Let them face something unexpected. The gates opened just enough to allow her party through. Captain Yusuf and 2 senior officers accompanied her, their hands carefully away from weapons. The walk across open ground to the Mongol position felt eternal. Each step carried her further from safety, closer to men who had perfected killing into art. The Mongol general dismounted as she approached, a gesture of minimal respect. His scarred face revealed nothing as the interpreter translated his words. The terms were exactly what she had expected. Immediate surrender. Gates opened fully. All weapons surrendered. The population sorted for processing. In exchange, the Khan might show mercy. Define mercy. Gulnar's response caught the interpreter off guard. Women didn't typically negotiate surrender terms. They certainly didn't challenge definitions. The general's eyes narrowed as the translation reached him. He spoke at length, his interpreter struggling to convey the full meaning. Mercy meant the elderly would die quickly. Children under 10 would be spared for slavery. Women would be distributed among warriors according to established protocols. Craftsmen with valuable skills might live. Fighting men would face execution, but perhaps not torture. And if we resist? She already knew the answer, but needed her escorts to hear it spoken aloud. The general's smile held no warmth. He gestured toward his vast army, then spoke a single word that needed no translation. The interpreter provided it anyway, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Annihilation. Gulnar studied the Mongol general's scarred face, reading decades of conquest in the lines around his eyes. This man had overseen the destruction of dozens of cities. He had reduced proud civilizations to ash and memory. Now he waited to add Otra to his collection. We need time to consider. The words emerged steady despite the tremor in her chest. Your terms require discussion with our council. The general nodded and held up 3 fingers. The same rhythm as the war drums. 3 days to choose between slavery and extinction. 3 sunsets before negotiation transformed into slaughter. The universal deadline that had broken 100 cities before them. As they returned through Otra's gates, Captain Yusuf whispered urgently. Perhaps we should reconsider. The terms aren't worse than other cities have received. Some of our people would survive. As property. Gulnar's response killed further discussion. Distributed like livestock. Our daughters bearing children for men who murdered their fathers. The council reconvened in emergency session. Word of the negotiations had already spread, creating ripples of panic through the city. Some called for immediate surrender. Others demanded resistance to the last breath. The division Gulnar had feared began to manifest. General Karim surprised everyone by supporting continued defiance. If we must die, let us die as men, not sorted like sheep for slaughter. Easy words from someone who'll die in battle. Uzbek the elder's voice shook with fear. What of our children? Our wives? Do we condemn them to horrors because warrior pride demands it? The argument escalated, voices rising as terror eroded civility. Gulnar watched the dissolution of unity that would make resistance impossible. The Mongols didn't need to breach the walls. Fear would open the gates from within. Enough. Her command cut through the chaos. We've heard the terms. Now hear mine. She moved to the center of the chamber, drawing their attention like a lodestone. The merchant's daughter, who had spent 3 decades in comfortable domesticity, now stood transformed by loss and necessity. Her husband's blood might still stain these floors, but his courage lived in her voice. Every city that has surrendered immediately still saw its women enslaved, its children scattered, its identity erased. She let each statement land like a hammer blow. Submission guarantees nothing except a different flavor of destruction. But resistance guarantees worse. Someone shouted from the back of the room. Does it? Gulnar pulled a scroll from her robes. My husband collected reports from every Mongol conquest. The pattern is clear. Quick surrender means organized slavery. Prolonged resistance means chaos and slaughter. But either path leads to the same destination. Captain Yusuf stepped forward. What do you propose? We make them remember Otrar. Her words rang with quiet determination. Not as another easy conquest, but as the city that cost them dearly, that fought with such fury they speak our name with respect. Respect from dead men means nothing. Uzbek's objection carried the weight of age and fear. Tell that to Thermopylae. Gulnar's reference to ancient Greek defiance against impossible odds silenced several critics. Some fights matter because of how they're fought, not whether they're won. The debate raged through the afternoon as the Mongol drums maintained their patient rhythm. 3 beats and silence. A countdown to catastrophe that focused minds wonderfully. By evening, exhaustion had accomplished what argument couldn't. The council voted to continue resistance, though several members clearly hoped for last-minute negotiations. Gulnar emerged from the chamber to find the courtyard filled with waiting citizens. Word of her leadership had spread, drawing those desperate for any hope. Women clutched children. Old men leaned on walking sticks, all searching her face for signs of salvation she couldn't provide. We fight. 2 words that changed everything. Not because we can win, but because surrender offers nothing worth preserving. The crowd's reaction mixed relief with terror. Some wept. Others nodded with grim satisfaction. A few slipped away, no doubt planning to attempt private negotiations with the besiegers. Gulnar let them go. Unity forced by fear was no unity at all. That night, she walked the walls with Captain Yusuf, inspecting positions and counting resources. The young officer had become her most trusted advisor, perhaps because he had nothing left to lose. His beloved friend lay dead with her middle son. Grief had transformed him as thoroughly as it had changed her. The women volunteers have exceeded expectations. His report offered rare positive news. They've established aid stations at every major intersection. Some are even training with crossbows. Gulnar paused at a battlement overlooking the Mongol camp. Thousands of fires dotted the plain like fallen stars. Each represented enemies who would soon test their defenses. The mathematics remained hopeless, but something had shifted in the city's spirit. Desperation bred its own form of courage. Double their weapon training. Her order surprised even her. When the walls fall. You think they'll fight? Yusuf's tone mixed admiration with concern. I think they'll choose their own endings. Gulnar touched the jeweled dagger at her waist. a wedding gift that had never seen use beyond opening letters. Sometimes that's the only victory available. The first night passed with sporadic probing attacks. Mongol horsemen tested responses, measuring reaction times and identifying weak points. Their arrows fell like brief rain showers, more message than serious assault. The real storm would come later. Dawn brought fresh horrors. The Mongols had captured refugees attempting to flee during the night. Now these unfortunates decorated poles arranged for the defenders to see. Still alive, their moans carried across the killing ground between army and city. The message was clear. No escape existed except through submission or death. Gulnar forced herself to watch from the tower, knowing her reaction would be reported throughout the city. If she showed weakness, resistance would crumble. The silk merchant's daughter had to display steel that generals might envy. Her face remained stone while her heart shattered at each distant cry. Cut them down. General Karim appeared beside her, his own composure cracking. Archers could end their suffering. Waste arrows on targets the Mongols want us to shoot. Gulnar shook her head. That's why they placed them just within range. To make us expend ammunition on mercy. The calculated cruelty of it struck even the veteran general. Every aspect of Mongol warfare followed careful planning. Terror wasn't random but precisely calibrated to achieve specific results. They had turned human suffering into military mathematics. The second day brought the siege engines forward. Great catapults that could throw stones the weight of men. Towers that would allow attackers to match the height of walls. Protective shelters for rams that could splinter gates. The mechanical precision of their assembly sent fresh waves of fear through the defenders. But something else was building within Otrar's walls. The women volunteers had transformed from medical support into something unprecedented. They appeared on battlements carrying water and arrows, but also weapons. Word spread that the governor's widow had authorized their armament. If the city would fall, every inhabitant would choose how they met that fate. This violates every tradition. General Karim's protest came privately, away from other ears. Women don't bear arms. It's unnatural. So is sorting human beings like grain. Gulnar checked the medical supplies one more time. The Mongols changed the rules of warfare. We're simply adapting. That evening, as the second sunset marked another deadline passed, she received an unexpected visitor. The baker's widow led a delegation of armed women to the command post. They had elected their own officers, organized their own units. What had begun as medical support had evolved into something that had no name in military terminology. We've trained 300. The baker's widow's report came with military precision that would have been absurd a week ago. Crossbows mostly. Some spears. We know we can't match warriors, but we can make crossing any street cost lives. Gulnar studied these transformed women. Mothers, sisters, daughters, wives. They had watched their men prepare for death and decided to claim that same right. The Mongols would expect to find cowering victims when they breached the walls. Instead, they would face something that violated every assumption about conquest. Station your units at secondary positions. Gulnar's acceptance formalized what had already occurred. When the primary defenses fall. Second, we hold the streets. The baker's widow finished the thought. Every house a fortress, every room a battlefield. Night fell with increased Mongol activity. The patient rhythm of drums had accelerated. 3 days had almost passed. Tomorrow would bring the full storm. In the darkness, final preparations proceeded with desperate efficiency. Children too young to fight were hidden in deep cellars. The elderly who chose combat over capture took positions they knew they'd never leave. Gulnar stood once more on the highest tower, Captain Yusuf beside her. Below, their city prepared for its last dawn. The transformation from 3 days ago seemed impossible. A merchant's wife had become a military commander. Domestic women had become irregular troops. A trading center had become a fortress of final stands. My lady, Yusuf's voice carried a weight beyond his years. Whatever tomorrow brings, know that you gave us something worth more than survival. What's that? Though she suspected the answer. Choice. He gestured toward the armed women taking positions. The Mongols offer only submission or slaughter. You gave us a third option. Defiance with dignity. The war drums stopped. Silence fell across the plain like a shroud. The 3-day deadline approached its end. Soon, negotiation would cease, and annihilation would begin. But Otrar would not go quietly. The silk merchant's daughter had seen to that. In her chamber, Gulnar penned final notes by candlelight. Not military commands, but personal farewells. Letters to distant relatives who might wonder at her transformation. Explanations for why a woman who had lived for family chose to die for principle. The words came slowly, each sentence weighted with finality. A messenger interrupted with urgent news. Mongol envoys approached under a flag of truce. One final opportunity for surrender before the deadline expired. The general who had conducted the first negotiation waited beyond the gates. Perhaps he wondered at the city's continued defiance. Perhaps he offered adjusted terms. Gulnar set down her pen and prepared to meet him. The jeweled dagger hung heavy at her waist. Tomorrow, she might need it for more than opening letters. But tonight, one last conversation remained. One final chance to choose slavery over extinction. She descended toward the gates, knowing what answer she would give. The women of Otrar had made their choice. They would not wait passively for distribution among conquerors. They would not accept the careful categories of submission. They would fight with whatever weapons they could hold, for as long as breath remained. The Mongol general waited in torchlight, his scarred face revealing surprise when she appeared. He had expected surrender by now. Most cities broke on the second night, when the reality of approaching annihilation overwhelmed abstract concepts like honor. But something had hardened within Otrar's walls, something he didn't yet understand. Through his interpreter, he made the final offer. Terms had not changed. Immediate submission might still bring mercy. The gates must open before dawn, or no quarter would be given. The 3-day rule allowed no exceptions. He had seen it enforced 100 times. Surely, she understood the mathematics of massacre. Gulnar listened to the translation, then spoke her response clearly. Tell your Khan that Otrar rejects his mercy. Tell him we choose death as free people, over life as property. Tell him that when he sorts through our ashes, he'll find the bones of women who died holding weapons rather than chains. The general's expression shifted from surprise to something that might have been respect. He had conquered cities for decades, seen every form of resistance and submission. But a city that armed its women, that chose annihilation over slavery, that transformed merchants' wives into warriors, this was new. He spoke a single phrase before turning away. The interpreter translated with something like awe. He says you've signed your death warrant with courage. He'll make certain the Khan knows that Otrar died unusually. As the gates closed behind her, Gulnar found hundreds of citizens waiting in the square. They had heard rumors of the final negotiation, feared she might accept terms to spare some lives. Her appearance in full resistance regalia answered their unspoken questions. Dawn brings the storm. Her words carried across the silent crowd. They offer us slavery or death. I've chosen death. Each of you must make your own decision. No one moved toward the gates. Whatever divisions had existed earlier had crystallized into unified defiance. The city would stand or fall as one. The women with their crossbows. The old men with their rusty swords. The children hiding in cellars. All bound by a choice that transformed certain defeat into something resembling victory. Captain Yusuf organized the final defensive positions. General Karim, his opposition to female fighters forgotten, distributed the last reserves of arrows. The baker's widow led her irregular units to their stations. Everyone understood that sunrise would bring horrors beyond imagination. They prepared, anyway. In the hours before dawn, Gulnar walked among her people one last time. She found women sharpening kitchen knives, men reinforcing barricades, teenagers copying final messages to loved ones. The transformation of Otrar was complete. A trading city had become a symbol of resistance, led by a silk merchant's daughter who had discovered steel in her spine. The eastern sky began to lighten, painting the approaching catastrophe in shades of amber and blood. Mongol siege engines crept forward like prehistoric beasts. The investment of 3 days' patience had ended. Now would come the harvest of defiance, reaped with sword and flame. Gulnar climbed to her command position, the jeweled dagger loose in its sheath. Around her, the unlikely defenders of Otrar prepared for their last day. They had chosen their ending. They had armed their women. They had rejected the mathematics of submission. What followed would echo through history as either glorious folly or magnificent defiance. As the first catapult stone crashed into Otrar's walls, she thought of her dead husband and sons. They had fallen before seeing this transformation, before witnessing a merchant community choose annihilation over dishonor, before watching their wife and mother become something the Mongols had rarely faced, a woman who refused to be sorted, categorized, or conquered. The siege of Otrar had begun in earnest. Its end would come soon, measured in hours rather than days. But those hours would cost the Mongols more than they had calculated. The 3-day rule assumed defenders would eventually break when faced with inevitable defeat. It hadn't accounted for a silk merchant's daughter with nothing left to lose. On the second night, she received an offer that would haunt her forever. The Mongol general himself came to the walls under cover of darkness, accompanied only by his interpreter and a single guard. His scarred face showed something she hadn't expected. Genuine curiosity about the woman who had transformed a merchant city into a fortress of martyrs. He spoke quietly, his words translated in whispers that barely carried across the night air. The Khan has authorized an unprecedented arrangement. You alone can leave. Take ship to distant lands. Live under another name. Your courage has earned this single mercy. But you must depart before dawn, and Otrar must open its gates. The interpreter paused, then added his own observation. In 30 years of conquest, I've never heard such an offer made. Gulnar stared at the Mongol general's weathered face, reading decades of conquest in the torchlight's shadows. The offer hung between them like a blade. Personal salvation in exchange for 30,000 lives. Her fingers found the jeweled dagger's hilt, its familiar weight suddenly foreign. The interpreter shifted nervously, unaccustomed to such prolonged silence. Your decision must come now. The general's voice carried neither threat nor sympathy. My men grow restless. Dawn approaches with blood. Behind her, the city slept fitfully. Children pressed against mothers in hidden cellars. Her volunteer women clutched crossbows at their posts. Captain Yusuf patrolled the walls, unaware his commander faced temptation that could unravel everything. The general studied her face, perhaps recognizing the war between survival and duty. You understand what you refuse. His scarred lips barely moved. No woman has led such resistance. The Khan respects courage, even in enemies. This offer will not come again. Gulnar's throat tightened. Images flooded her mind unbidden. A ship cutting through foreign waters, waking without the weight of command. Growing old in some distant market, selling silk to strangers who would never know her name. The general's guard fingered his sword, growing nervous at the extended parley. Tell me something. Her words emerged steady despite the tremor in her chest. When your men sort the survivors tomorrow, when they distribute our women like grain rations, will you remember this moment? The general's expression shifted minutely. The interpreter hesitated before translating the response. Every city blends into the next. But yes, I will remember the woman who could have lived. A child's cry echoed from somewhere within the walls. One of thousands who would face Mongol justice at sunrise. Gulnar straightened her spine, decision crystallizing like winter ice. The dagger slipped back into its sheath with a whisper of metal on leather. I have no sons left to shame with cowardice. Each word fell like stones into still water. No husband to disappoint with betrayal. Only these people who trusted a merchant's daughter with their lives. The general nodded once, something like approval flickering across his features. He spoke a single phrase before turning away. The interpreter translated with obvious reluctance. He says your death will be memorable. Not merciful, but memorable. The darkness swallowed them. Gulnar remained at the wall, trembling now that witnesses had departed. The magnitude of her refusal crashed over her like a tide. She had chosen agony over escape, principles over preservation. Below, a guard called out the watch, unaware his commander had just sealed all their fates. Captain Yusuf appeared from the shadows, concern etched across his young features. My lady? The sentries reported movement at this section. Just ghosts. She forced steadiness into her voice. Check the eastern positions. Dawn will test them first. He departed with military precision, leaving her alone with consequences. The offer would remain her secret, a burden carried to whatever end awaited. She had asked the general about memory, but would anyone remember her choice? Would history record the moment a silk merchant's daughter refused the only mercy Mongols ever extended? The eastern sky began its treacherous lightning. Soon, impossibly soon, the bombardment would resume. But something had changed in the darkness. The general's unprecedented offer proved Otrar had already achieved something remarkable. They had forced the Mongols to attempt negotiation beyond standard terms. She descended the stairs, each step heavier than the last. In the courtyard, her irregular women fighters prepared for battle with kitchen knives and borrowed crossbows. They looked up as she passed, drawing strength from her presence. If they knew what she had just refused on their behalf, would they thank her or curse her? The baker's widow approached with her morning report. 300 ready at positions. The youngest we've hidden as you ordered. The oldest. She paused, struggling with military terminology that still felt foreign. The oldest have volunteered for the most dangerous posts. They choose their endings. Gulnar touched the woman's shoulder, as we all must. Word of increased Mongol activity spread like fire through straw. Defenders rushed to positions. Weapons were checked one final time. Prayers whispered to whatever gods might still listen. The 3-day deadline had expired. Now came consequences. Gulnar climbed to her command post as the first stones began to fly. The Mongol catapults worked with mechanical precision, each impact shaking the ancient walls. Dust filled the air. Screams echoed from struck positions. The mathematics of massacre had begun. North wall buckling. A messenger arrived breathless. General Karim requests reinforcements. She dispatched units, knowing each decision meant death for someone. The Mongols probed systematically, testing responses, identifying weaknesses. Their experience showed in every calculated attack. Otrar's defenders fought with desperate courage, but courage meant little against expertise. By midday, 3 breaches gaped in the outer walls. Mongol assault troops poured through like water through broken dams. The fighting transformed from distant bombardment to intimate slaughter. Steel met steel in narrow streets. Arrows found flesh at close range. The irregular women fighters faced their first real test. A runner brought news that froze her blood. The baker's widow's unit holds the market square. They've stopped 2 advances, but the boy's voice cracked. They're dying by dozens. She requests permission to fall back. Denied. The word tasted like ashes. They hold until relieved or dead. The runner's young face showed shock at her coldness. He didn't understand the arithmetic. Every position held meant time bought elsewhere. Every street contested meant higher costs for conquest. The women had chosen to fight. She would honor that choice with tactical necessity. Captain Yusuf's sector fell silent. Too silent. She dispatched scouts who returned with fragments of his unit banner and nothing else. Another name added to the ledger of loss. Another friend fed to the Mongol appetite. The young officer who had knelt first in support of her command would never see the end he had helped create. "My lady." General Karim stumbled into the command post, his left arm hanging useless. "The eastern district burns. We've lost contact with all units there. The Mongols bring more siege engines. They mean to level the entire city." She studied the map, calculating remaining options. Half their defenders lay dead. Ammunition ran low. The Mongols advanced methodically, claiming ground they would never surrender. Yet pockets of resistance still flared. The arithmetic hadn't concluded. "Pull back to the inner city." Her orders came with icy clarity. "Every building becomes a fortress, every room a grave for attackers. We make them pay for each stone." The retreat unfolded in barely controlled chaos. Defenders fell back through streets they had protected since childhood. Bodies littered familiar squares. The Mongol advance pressed close, cutting down stragglers without mercy. But the inner city's narrower streets favored desperate defenders over disciplined attackers. Night fell on a city transformed into a charnel house. Fires provided the only light, casting dancing shadows on scenes of systematic horror. The Mongols had begun their sorting in conquered districts. Gulnar could hear it from her new position, the mechanical efficiency of human categorization. A blood-covered woman stumbled into the command post. One of her volunteers, though barely recognizable. She carried a Mongol head by its hair, trophy of some desperate last stand. Her report came in gasps between obvious pain. The market square held for 6 hours. The baker's widow died on her feet, took 8 of them with her. They didn't expect. A cough brought blood to her lips. Didn't expect women to fight like demons. Gulnar helped her to a bench, knowing no medical aid remained. The woman's eyes already glazed with approaching death, but she gripped Gulnar's wrist with surprising strength. Was it worth it? The question carried no accusation, only desperate need for meaning. Did we matter? Every death mattered. Gulnar held the woman's gaze until it fixed on nothing. Every hour of defiance wrote history. The second day of conquest dawned red through smoke. Mongol drums announced fresh assaults. The inner city's defenses crumbled section by section. Gulnar moved her command post 3 times, each retreat marking territory permanently lost. The irregular women fighters had been reduced to scattered handfuls, but they still contested every advance. General Karim found her in the afternoon, his wounds wrapped in torn silk. The temple district holds, barely, maybe 300 defenders left. The Mongols mass for a final push. We have perhaps hours. She nodded, touching the jeweled dagger that had become her constant companion. Soon, it would serve its final purpose. But first came the last acts of defiance, the final costs imposed on conquerors who expected easy victory. Gather whoever remains. Her voice carried across the ruined command post. We make our stand at the governor's palace. Let them work for every room. The retreat to the palace became a fighting withdrawal through streets she had walked as a young bride. Past the silk market where she had learned to haggle. Through the square where her sons had played. Each familiar landmark now bore scars of conquest. The transformation of her city mirrored her own evolution from merchant's wife to military commander. Inside the palace walls perhaps 200 defenders gathered. Many bore wounds. All carried the exhaustion of impossible resistance. The women volunteers numbered less than 40, their ranks decimated but spirits unbroken. They had learned lessons no military manual taught. The Mongols offer no quarter now. Gulnar addressed them from the same steps where her husband once held court. We've cost them too much for mercy. But we've also proved something they didn't expect. Otrar dies on its feet, not its knees. A ragged cheer answered her. These people had followed a silk merchant's daughter into hopeless battle. They had seen their city burn rather than submit. Now they would write the final chapter in blood and defiance. The Mongol assault began at sunset. They came with the patience of experienced conquerors, advancing room by room through the palace complex. Each chamber became a battlefield. Each corridor cost lives. The defenders sold ground dearly. Understanding this was their last currency. Gulnar commanded from the central tower until it became untenable. She fell back through halls where she had raised 3 sons, past chambers where her husband had worried over defensive preparations that now served their grim purpose. The Mongol advance pressed inexorably, but she had one final surprise prepared. In the deepest cellars, the last volunteers waited, not fighters but the elderly and wounded who had chosen their ending. They sat among the oil stores and grain reserves her husband had so carefully accumulated. When the Mongols finally breached the palace's heart, they would find no cowering survivors to sort, only flame and defiance. Light them, her command echoed in the stone chambers. Let the palace become our pyre. The volunteers worked with shaking hands, spreading oil and setting sparks. Smoke began to rise through the palace floors. The Mongols above would soon face a choice between retreat and incineration. Either way, they would not claim their expected prizes. Gulnar climbed stairs already growing hot, the jeweled dagger finally drawn. Behind her, flame consumed the stores that should have fed conquerors. Ahead, the palace's main hall filled with Mongol warriors seeking the woman who had defied all convention. She emerged onto the same balcony where this nightmare had begun. Below, the Mongol general waited with his troops. The scarred face showed no surprise at her appearance. Perhaps he had expected this final gesture from the woman who refused escape. You could have lived. His words carried across the smoke-filled space. Sailed to safety while your people burned. Why choose this? She raised the dagger, its jewels catching the firelight from below. The flames climbed faster now, turning the palace into a torch visible for miles. Her voice rang clear despite the smoke. "Because a merchant's daughter learned something you'll never understand." The blade trembled in her grip. Some things matter more than living. Some choices echo longer than life. The general gestured to his archers, but she moved faster. The jeweled dagger that had once opened letters found its final purpose. As she fell, the palace erupted in flames behind her, consuming the last defenders who had chosen cremation over capture. Otrar burned through the night. The Mongols withdrew from the inferno, their systematic conquest transformed into something resembling defeat. They had taken the city, but at costs no one had calculated. Worse, they had lost the prizes they expected. No women to distribute, no slaves to claim, only ashes and the memory of unprecedented defiance. Dawn brought the sound every defender dreaded, not war drums or battle cries, but the systematic thud of executioners' blades beginning their work. The few survivors pulled from the ruins would face public demonstration of what happened to cities that resisted past 3 days. But Otrar had already won its victory, written in fire, and the transformed courage of a silk merchant's daughter. The first stone shattered against Otrar's northern wall at dawn, a fist-sized projectile that exploded into deadly fragments, cutting down 2 defenders before they could scream. The siege engines worked in sequence now, mechanical monsters fed by Mongol efficiency. Every 3 heartbeats, another impact shook the ancient fortifications. Gulnar gripped the battlement as dust cascaded from above. The mathematics of destruction unfolded before her eyes. 20 catapults maintaining constant fire. Each stone precisely aimed at structural weak points her husband had worried about for years. She turned to General Karim, whose face had drained of color. "Pull the men back from Section 4. Her command cut through the bombardment's thunder. "The wall won't hold another hour." Below in the streets, her irregular fighters took positions. Women who had learned crossbow basics just days ago now faced the reality of warfare. The baker's widow organized her unit behind overturned merchant carts, creating makeshift barriers across the main thoroughfare. Their faces showed fear transformed into something harder. A runner arrived, gasping from the eastern sector. Blood streaked his tunic from a glancing blow. His words tumbled out between desperate breaths. Captain Yusuf reports 3 breaches forming, Mongol infantry massing behind their engines. He estimates 2 hours before they attempt entry. 2 hours to prepare for street-by-street slaughter. Gulnar dispatched reinforcements, knowing she robbed other sectors of defenders. Every decision meant death for someone. The arithmetic of command tasted bitter as wormwood. The bombardment shifted rhythm. Incendiary projectiles joined the stones, trailing fire across morning sky. They struck wooden structures, birthing infernos that would channel defenders into killing grounds. The Mongols had studied Otrar's layout, identifying which fires would create maximum disruption. "They're driving us toward the market square." General Karim recognized the pattern, funneling our forces into open ground where their archers can work. Gulnar nodded, already adjusting deployments. Let the Mongols think their strategy succeeded. The market square held surprises, courtesy of her husband's paranoid preparations. Hidden cellars beneath merchant stalls, concealed passages between buildings, urban terrain that favored desperate defenders over organized attackers. A tremendous crack split the morning air. Section 4's wall collapsed in rolling thunder, massive stones tumbling into rubble slopes. Through the dust cloud, Mongol assault troops appeared like demons from nightmares. They moved with practiced coordination, shields locked, advancing over their own siege debris. First breach. The cry echoed across defensive positions. Gulnar watched General Karim rush toward the breakthrough with his personal guard. Old rivalries forgotten in the face of annihilation. Behind him, regular soldiers formed ranks with shaking hands. They knew the odds. They formed up anyway. The clash of armies striking echoed between buildings. Mongol discipline met Otrar desperation in narrow confines that negated numerical advantage. Bodies fell on both sides, blood mixing with dust to create crimson mud. The first assault wave faltered, pulled back to reorganize. But more breaches opened with each passing hour. The eastern wall crumbled under concentrated fire. The southern gate, reinforced with her husband's improvements, finally splintered beneath battering rams. The Mongols poured through like water, finding every weakness. In the streets, her women fighters faced their baptism. A unit of Mongol infantry rounded a corner directly into crossbow fire from second-story windows. Bolts found gaps in armor, dropping warriors who expected cowering civilians. The surprise lasted seconds before return fire cleared the windows, but those seconds cost Mongol lives. Pull back to second positions. Gulnar's standing orders activated as outer defenses crumbled. The retreat unfolded in barely controlled chaos. Defenders fell back through streets they'd known since childhood, leaving corpses at each intersection. Some units maintained cohesion, others dissolved into running battles. The Mongols advanced methodically behind them, claiming ground stained with fresh death. Noon brought horror to conquered sections. Through smoke and distance, Gulnar heard the mechanical sounds of sorting. Mongol administrators had perfected their system through countless cities. Male voices shouting age assessments, female screams cut short by fists, children's cries as families were divided forever. A blood-soaked messenger staggered into her relocated command post. One of her volunteer women, though barely recognizable beneath gore and dust. She collapsed against a doorframe, words emerging through obvious agony. The baker's widow holds the square. Mongols tried to flank through the covered market. We dropped the ceiling on them, crushed a whole unit. Pride flickered through pain. She says to tell you the women of Otrar know how to fight. The messenger's eyes fixed on nothing before Gulnar could respond. Another name for the growing ledger. Another woman who chose weapon over chains. Outside, the battle's tide turned inexorably against them. Captain Yusuf appeared like a ghost from smoke, his armor scarred by multiple impacts. Half his unit followed, the other half would never follow anyone again. His report came in clipped military phrases that couldn't mask exhaustion. Eastern District lost. They're bringing up more engines. Fresh troops rotating in. He paused, struggling with the next words. General Karim fell at the northern breach. Took 12 with him. Another pillar of defense toppled. Gulnar absorbed the loss, filed it with all the others. Grief was luxury she couldn't afford. Not while hundreds still looked to her for miracles she couldn't provide. Take command of remaining regulars. Her appointment made him the youngest general in Otrar's history. History that measured now in hours. Hold the inner city approaches. The Mongol advance pressed through afternoon into evening. They had perfected urban warfare through practice, turning Otrar's own buildings into weapons. Fires channeled defenders into crossfire zones. Collapsed structures blocked retreat routes. Every tactic showed careful study of city fighting. But Otrar's defenders had advantages too. Knowledge of every alley, every hidden passage, every cellar that connected to another. The women fighters proved especially effective at ambush, appearing where least expected, striking before melting back into familiar terrain. A Mongol officer learned this fatally when pursuing fleeing civilians into what seemed a dead-end alley. The civilians were bait. The women waiting in doorways with kitchen knives were the trap. His elite status meant nothing when 10 blades found every gap in armor. Such victories came dear and temporary. For every Mongol who fell, 3 defenders died. The mathematics ground inexorably toward 0. Gulnar relocated her command post twice more, each move marking territory forever lost. Night fell on a city transformed into Hell's anteroom. Fires painted the sky orange. Screams echoed from conquered districts where sorting continued by torchlight. The systematic nature of it struck her anew. Victory and atrocity followed the same methodical procedures. She found herself atop the governor's palace, surveying destruction that had once been home. Below, perhaps 600 defenders still fought in scattered pockets. The women volunteers had been reduced to 100, their ranks devastated but spirit intact. They had exceeded every expectation, including their own. Captain Yusuf, now General Yusuf by necessity, climbed the stairs with effort. Blood seeped through makeshift bandages. His youth had burned away in one day of impossible command. The report he carried would have broken stronger souls. The Temple District falls within the hour. Market Square can't hold much longer. He gestured toward distant fire. They're systematically destroying every structure that might shelter resistance. Gulnar touched the jeweled dagger, its weight familiar now. Soon it would serve its purpose. But not yet. Not while defenders still drew breath. Not while her transformation from silk merchant to war leader remained incomplete. Gather everyone who can still fight. Her words carried resignation and steel in equal measure. We make our final position here. The palace represented more than defensive advantage. Her husband had ruled from these halls. Her sons had played in these courtyards. If Otrar must fall, let it fall from its heart. Let the Mongols work for every stone of the citadel. Survivors trickled in through the night. Regular soldiers missing limbs. Women volunteers clutching bloody crossbows. Citizens who had grabbed weapons from the fallen. They numbered fewer than 300 when the count finished. The entire defensive force of a city that had housed 70,000. Among them came the baker's widow, carried by two younger women, gut-shot but still breathing, still commanding. She had held the market square for 9 hours, turning merchant stalls into killing grounds. The Mongols would remember that square. Did we matter? The question emerged through blood-bubbled lips. Gulnar knelt beside the dying woman. Around them, the last defenders prepared positions they would never retreat from. The answer came without hesitation. Every bolt you fired, every hour you held, every Mongol who learned that women could fight. She gripped the woman's hand. You changed their world forever. The baker's widow smiled and died. Another hero added to the rolls. Another woman who had chosen her ending. Dawn would bring the final reckoning, but the transformation was already complete. Mongol drums announced the last assault. They came with patience earned through victory, advancing through palace gates in perfect formation. No rush, no waste. They had learned respect for these defenders who fought beyond reason. The palace's outer defenses crumbled quickly. Too few defenders, too many breaches. But each room became a separate battle. Each corridor cost lives. The Mongols found no easy victory here, only room by room slugging through opponents who had passed beyond fear. In the throne room, Gulnar made her stand with the last fighters. Women and men together, distinction meaningless now. They had no ammunition left, only blades and desperation. When Mongols finally breached the great doors, hand-to-hand combat erupted with primal fury. She fought with the jeweled dagger, its decorative purpose transformed to deadly intent. Beside her, a weaver's daughter wielded a captured Mongol sword. Beyond gender, beyond class, beyond everything except the choice to die standing. The end came as it must. Overwhelming numbers prevailed. When only a dozen defenders remained, the Mongol general himself entered. The same scarred face from negotiations. He studied the blood-soaked woman who had transformed merchants into warriors. You could have lived. Not accusation, but genuine puzzlement. Why choose this? Gulnar stood among the bodies of her people, the dagger still firm in her grip. Her answer rang through the charnel house of the throne room. Because some things matter more than living. She raised the blade. Remember that when you sought through our ashes. Otrar's women chose death over submission. We chose to fight rather than be distributed like grain rations. The general gestured to his archers. She moved faster, the jeweled wedding gift finding her heart before arrows could fly. As she fell, the last defenders followed her example. The Mongols found no living prizes in Otrar's palace, only corpses who had chosen their own endings. Behind them, fire spread through the lower floors. The oil stores ignited by wounded volunteers who preferred cremation to capture. The palace became a pyre visible for miles, consuming defenders and architecture alike. The Mongols withdrew from advancing flames, their systematic conquest disrupted by unprecedented defiance. Dawn revealed the cost. Otrar had fallen, but at a price that would echo through the campaign. 5,000 Mongol casualties for a city that should have cost 500. No valuable captives, no noble women for distribution, no submission to parade before future targets. The 3-day rule had been enforced, but its victim had transformed the terms. A silk merchant's daughter had led fishwives and weavers to martial glory. Women expected to cower had died holding weapons. The careful categories of conquest had shattered against unexpected resistance. In the ruins, Mongol scribes tallied losses and lessons. The name Gulnar would not appear in their records. History, written by victors, rarely names defeated heroes. But the story spread anyway, carried by traumatized survivors and impressed enemies. The battle for the inner city begins next.